Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. I'm so excited that you're here with us. With me, as always, is Pastor Mike. Welcome to episode 70, Pastor Mike.
70.
We made it to 70.
I've got nothing cool to say about 70.
No, I think we've moved on from your...
I ran out
we're
a long
approaching,
time ago.
I don't know what the life expectancy is anymore, but I think we're past it at 70 here. So I think you're out of funny quips about what about how old the podcast is.
Saying my humor is dead.
Or you're just, or you're just tired from 70
that
70
could be it. That could be it.
I think that's it.
I did have to grab some caffeine before we came in here today, and that's not a good sign. So,
because of me or just general tiredness?
Yes.
Do I not want the answer to that
you don't
question?
want me to answer that one.
Are you wearing a new Oklahoma Wesleyan shirt?
It is.
Is this from your most recent trip to Oklahoma
recent
Wesleyan?
trip down there, yeah. They were kind and said, go pick out a shirt. And so I did.
I assume your closet has less Oklahoma Wesleyan apparel that fits you these days than it once did?
That was part of it. I think they had one that they planned for me, and they were like, okay, that won't fit. Go pick one out for yourself.
You were there for homecoming?
Homecoming,
right.
Board of Trustees.
Right,
I'm on the Board of Trustees.
You were there during homecoming as well. Do they do anything fun for alumni at Oklahoma?
This year especially they did, because Oklahoma Wesleyan is actually the combination of several different schools. And one of them is Miltonvale Wesleyan School, which was a school in Kansas.
Oh, yeah,
it celebrated the 50th year of the merger.
Being apart, okay.
So they invited...
Where did you say that school was?
In Miltonvale, Kansas, originally.
Oh, that's a town, Miltonvale.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, some of our New Hopers, we've got one or two New Hopers that attended that school. And so they did a big reunion for those that were from Miltonvale originally, and they were thinking, we might get 100. They had 200, well over 200, closing on 300 show up, and that's
pretty cool.
It was a lot of fun. Of course, Kylie and I, from our travels over the years and time, we knew a lot of people, but even just talking to them, because it was a high school academy as well as a college back then.
Okay,
and so a lot of these kids back then kind of almost grew up together. So it was just fun to watch them and enjoy it. So it was huge.
Why would it have merged with Oakwood? And isn't there a Kansas Wesleyan?
Yeah, but that's not associated with
us.
And
it wasn't even back then?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
So you've told me before that a lot of the colleges with the name Wesleyan in it aren't associated with like the Wesleyan Church.
Not
I just
with
assumed,
this Wesleyan Church. Yeah. So a lot of them are Free Methodists.
Okay.
Yep. A lot of them are associated with Free Methodists, which is nearly identical theologically.
Okay. In my brain it was just they once were, and then they just stopped. They didn't want to be like the Christian college anymore, but they just kept their name.
No, John and Charles Wesley evidently didn't copyright their name.
Interesting. Yeah. What a weird move on their part.
Yeah, I don't know why.
They should have known that one day there'd be like 50 colleges named after them, and they would want.
So in the Wesleyan Church we have Oklahoma Wesleyan, Oklahoma, Indiana Wesleyan, Southern Wesleyan down in the Carolinas, and Houghton in Houghton, New York. And then we have a seminary in Indiana, and then we have a Bible college in Kansas. Those are ours.
What's
in the
Bible
Wesleyan
college
Church.
in Kansas?
Called Kingswood, Canada. I'm sorry.
Oh, in Canada. Okay.
Kingswood.
Oh, is that where Pastor?
That's where Pastor Kylie went. Yep. Okay. And Pastor Anna went now, because I think we can call her Pastor, because I think her licensing just came.
Oh, is that where she was doing her? Nice.
Yep.
I didn't know it was through.
Yep.
The Canadian one, whose name I already forgot, even though you said
Kingswood.
it 20. So that one, that's the one. Well, shall we talk about some Joshua? We've started our new mini series now.
Yeah.
If you weren't with us this last weekend, make sure you go check that out. You can find the service on our YouTube channel, and do make sure you subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done that yet. Get notified. I think you teased it a couple weeks ago, but we're going to have a upcoming special episode for sure. Special episode. I think when you were on with Hattie, I think you talked about it.
Yep.
I'm trying to remember, but I watched that one. I think that's why it's top of head.
When Hattie was here, and it was a much better podcast that week.
Yeah, definitely. There's no question about that. I'm not sure why she's not here right now. I think the comments were full of just bring back Hattie.
Yeah, probably.
But it was me posting that. But make sure you do subscribe, because those will come out. We don't know what day those will go out, but you'll get notified when those go live. So yeah, we're excited for those.
Yeah.
But we're now in Promised Land.
We are.
And so we're going to talk about the Promised Land.
We
Let's
are.
promise some lands.
Okay,
Is that
that
what
was
we're
a
doing?
dad joke.
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well,
Yeah.
interestingly, in order to promise land, it was Joshua.
Yep.
Was where we were this first
So we
weekend.
did the entire
Teaching.
book of Joshua in 1 week. Yeah.
Because there's not that much happens in that book, right? So we
Yeah,
can
and
just
next
cover
week will
fast.
be the entire book of Judges.
Yeah, there were only like
Yeah.
2 judges, so
Yeah.
we
Then
can
we'll
run
slow
through.
down.
But in order to promise that land,
Yeah.
there were people there you may have read and heard about.
The Canaanites is kind of the general term that was used to describe them.
And that sounds like that's kind of a bummer for those people, huh? That,
Yeah.
Hey, the Israelites
It's good.
showed up and we're all
Either
gonna,
kicked out or wiped out.
Yeah, those were your
Yeah.
2 options.
Yeah.
How are we supposed to, I don't know, I can't think of the word I want right now, but how are we supposed to tie this loving God that we know of, especially like this New Testament God that we know, who despite everything horrible that I've done, sent his son to die for me and looks after me and cares about me. And, if even the birds of the air are taken care of course he's going to take care of me, unless I'm a Canaanite in the Old Testament, in which case I'm going to be slaughtered. How are we supposed to wrap our heads around the difference between the two?
I don't know. I thought you'd answer that today.
All right, so my first answer, no, that is not my job.
Yeah. And that's a hard one. And a lot of people actually have, this has been an obstacle to Christianity for them. It's like there's 2 gods.
Sure.
Is God bipolar? Is he schizophrenic? And we talked about it this weekend a little bit, and I gave us some upper story things right at the top, and you can go back and listen to them. But a couple of things we need to understand from the top. It's not so much as God giving it to Israel and pushing everybody out or wiping everybody out, as much as he is taking it from the Amorites, Canaanites, the others that are in there. In fact, Deuteronomy 9, I read it this weekend. He says to the Israelites, but Moses says this before they even go in. It's not because of your righteousness. In other words, not just because you're special, but because they had rejected God. But like we talked about this weekend, and I want to get to in a little bit more depth in just a moment, they had repeatedly rejected God. And God speaks and works within that context. And if he had just moved them out, it would not have been enough to deal with the sin. And we'll work on that. But here's the thing we need to understand, because people struggle. So if you, and again, I referred to this a little bit on the weekend, but let me go into it a little bit more. There's a whole section of biblical kind of, I'll use the term scholar loosely. Others won't like it just because that just tells you what I think about it. It's modern biblical criticism. And they look at the book of Joshua as they believe that it was written sometime during the Babylonian captivity. So much later in the Old Testament. And then it was written as political propaganda to prove that they needed to go back and have their land. But if we go all the way back some 600 years before Joshua, Genesis chapter 15, where we talked about God's promise to Abram, this will be your land. But you can read in verse 16 that God tells Abram, you aren't going to receive the land in your lifetime. That eventually he would give it to his descendants in just the right time. And he goes on to say, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back. And here's what he says, keyword, for the sins of the Amorites have not yet reached their full measure. And part of so there's 2 things that's saying. It's one, God always gives time for repentance and deliverance. 2, God knew what their decision would be. He didn't make their decision for them, but he knew what their decision would be. And if we go back, they were sinful people just like us, but they let their sin just go full speed ahead. And in that day, because we don't fully understand in the Western world, but it was a tribal culture. So even though, yes, everybody individually made their decisions, and we find out later, like Rahab and her family could go against the tribe, but that was very uncommon. what one person did, the tribe did. So they were all in this together, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And one of the things we need to remember, think of other times, maybe in more recent history, where leaders and areas just go completely dark. Think of Hitler. Think of Saddam Hussein, and we could go on through some of the others, and just detestable, brutal things that they did to people. And we call that wicked. We call that evil. And most of us would say that it would be totally just because they're so bad to remove them. But when we start reading the Bible, it's like, but God can't do that. But sometimes evil needs to be removed, and we have to wrestle with that.
I think a question that a lot of people might have then is, why does God let it get so bad? If I'm God, and thank goodness for all of us I'm not, but if I'm God and I'm like, okay, I see this situation now is starting to get bad, and I know for a fact it's going to get so much worse. Why do I wait until it gets worse? Like I know that they're going to make the wrong decision. Yeah. So why wouldn't he? Why wasn't he just like, hey, instead of waiting for your great grandchildren to take over, like, I'm just going to wipe them out now, and you can take over.
I'll give a philosophy answer on this, which sounds like a cop-out. And actually, I have it kind of later in some of our notes. Sounds like a cop-out, but it's really not. By definition, if God is God, capital G, then we don't and will not fully understand what he does, not because it doesn't mean it's not good. And here, this is the philosophy. Just because we don't understand why it's good doesn't mean it's not good. Okay? I was in a small group the other night, one of the small groups that I'm part of, and a couple people just shared some personal stories about some personal just pain that's happening in their lives, and the rest of us had no idea what was happening, and a few of us, ended up in tears, and we're just reminded. In fact, somebody said across the room, said, we have no idea what stories are being written in each other's lives because we don't always know, and just because we don't understand doesn't mean that what the decisions that person is making are good or whatever, because we don't know the full story. By definition, God is God. He knows the full story. He sees the full workout in history. He sees it to the depths of their hearts, and he doesn't make the choices for us, but he knows our choices. And that's one of the philosophical stones that will trip us up. But by definition, again, I just can't say that enough. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not good. And doesn't mean it's not loving. Sometimes the most loving thing that can happen is to stop evil in its tracks, and just stop it. I mean, the flood, we say, how was that, Ruth? But the flood was loving. God slowed sin down.
Speaking of wickedness and sin, do we know what the Amorites were doing?
I'll give it. We just look at Scripture. Deuteronomy 12, Deuteronomy 20, Exodus 34. Not only they worship other gods, they engaged in widespread prostitution. So people, I heard someone say the other day that, in fact, Hattie and I talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago. Well, isn't slavery kind of dead? No, slavery, there are actually more people in slavery today than any other time in history. We just don't experience it here in America. But the sex trade, the clothing trade around the world in slavery. But
there's another one, chocolate.
I haven't heard that
I learned that the majority of the chocolate comes from like cocoa farms or whatever that are run on slave labor. I learned that recently, and there's a chocolate company that they honestly, just their packaging looked really good and their chocolate's good, and then you learn more about it, and their whole focus is we make sure that we don't source it from any slave. And I was like, chocolate, even our chocolate is coming from slave labor. It's wild how it, here we
look at that and go,
feel like
this is awful.
Happen.
This is horrific. And now take that to an exponential level. People would take their kids to the temples and offer them as sex slaves. And they thought that was a wonderful thing to do in all kinds of perverted acts. They would burn their children alive and listen to their screams to get their God's attention. And you just go through. There's one scholar, I read this last week, called this area a snake pit of child sacrifice and sacred prostitution. They're always abusing and taking advantage of the most vulnerable and devaluing everything about life. And God just says, enough. He gave them time. And we ask the question, why does God wait so long? And the answer is because he knows what we don't.
Yeah.
It's not an answer that honestly satisfies me,
right.
if I'm really honest.
Not at all.
But we go back to our beginning thread. God is always at work. God is always involved, and everything he does is good. So, and that's a faith step, because we don't always see it. And we won't always see it until later when we look back and we see his fingerprints on it, but we weren't able to see them.
How do I deal with if I'm struggling with a lack of faith in a situation? So maybe it is me reading the Old Testament being like, look what was happening in the name of God to the women and children.
Yeah.
I mean, Joshua's pretty violent. And next week we're getting to another book with a lot of
bloody.
Or maybe it's just something that's going on in in my life or around me today where I'm just like I want to believe what you're saying, Pastor Mike. I want to believe that everything, like God is loving, everything he does is good. I want to believe that. But I'm, if I struggle with that faith and then I recognize I'm struggling with that faith, so then doubt comes in. Well, do I really believe if I'm struggling to believe that he's good in this moment? What would you say to somebody who's kind of going through that thought process?
Part of this is we want to distill Christianity or religion in general down to I'm not sure I have enough faith, and we ask for definitive proof. But the reality of it is there is no system of thinking about life in the world that doesn't require faith at some level. There is no system that doesn't require faith at some level. Secular thought requires faith at some level. There's actually a podcast that I would recommend. It's a limited number of podcasts. They only did it for a while.
It's called The Grow Podcast.
Yeah.
Oh,
Tim Keller, and I'll remind me, and I'll get you the notes, because this wasn't necessarily mine, and the link, and we'll put this in the show notes. Tim Keller, but you can Google it, did a series of Q&As in New York, Pastor Tim Keller, in 2019. And they invited people who identified as non-Christian to come and they were invited by their friends who were Christians and said, let's just come and have a dialogue. And Tim talks through the faith required for secular thinking, Christian thinking, any other faith system. He said it takes almost an equal amount of faith. But he just walks through and much more openly and honestly, because I think one of the mistakes we've made as Christians is, is going one of two ways. Well, you just have to have faith. And it's like, well, okay, on what? Or we've gone the other way and said, well, I think it absolutely proves it. Well, it doesn't absolutely prove it. Yeah. God left some room for faith. So I hear all that to say, my primary answer is don't give up on it because it doesn't make sense yet. Follow we're walking down threads. Follow the thread through. And I was thinking about this last week and kind of as we were preparing for this, and I wrote down, some things that have just helped me in my own wrestling with some of the bloodiness and the stuff of this. One of them is, we struggle, like you just asked, we struggle when God doesn't punish injustice. Yeah. But then we struggle when he does. You can't have it both ways. So do you want him not to be a just God? Or do you want him, and not and let things go? Or do you want him to be a just God? And we say, well, he can't be just and loving. Why not? I think actually God shows justice and loving. He knows how to do them both, act perfectly just and loving at the same time. And the cross is the example with that. Sin has a price, and it had to be paid. That's perfect justice. But what's he do? He pays the price himself. That's the path of blood from Abraham. The other thing when we wrestle with this, always look in the Old Testament, God always gave time. We read the story in a paragraph. God gave them 600 years.
Yeah.
And now he knew they aren't turning back. And God knew that. We don't know that,
right.
And third thing is, we've already talked about, God is God, we are not. And I just have to wrestle with that sometimes. Mm-hmm. If I really believe in God, then I've got to trust them. Yeah. Fourth thing is, we were not there. It's a different context, different world, And the last thing we have to be reminded is God showed grace. And we talked about it in the weekend teaching in Joshua. The story of Rahab is an amazing story. Here's a woman who is not only a prostitute in a horrible, messed up city, but she's the owner of a brothel because she had her own place in the city wall. That meant it was her place. That meant it was the brothel in a place that was not just known for prostitution. It was known for amazingly perverted, beyond mature audiences only, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And she had the opportunity to turn to God. And did she become perfect overnight? No, she didn't. But she turned and she learned and she became part of the family of God. In fact, so much so that Jesus included her in his genealogy. Mm-hmm. She was a descendant of Abraham.
Yeah.
And there's a story of grace. God didn't just go and say, we're going to wipe out this people. He gave them opportunity, even in the last moments. And those things help me.
Yeah. I want to talk about Achan.
Yeah, because we didn't touch any of that story.
Is that how you pronounce it? That's how I've always... Achan. Yeah,
A-C-H. I've heard it Achan or Achan. I don't know exactly. I just say Achan. It sounds like maybe it's being a little pretentious.
Yeah, it's
pretending like we know Hebrew.
Too fancy for me. So his story always makes me think of now I just forgot, the blind man, the paralyzed man, whatever. When the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents?
Yeah.
That he was born blind. Yeah. The man born blind. And Jesus, is basically like, you guys are ridiculous.
Yeah.
But then in this scenario, Achan's sin not only affects his own family horrific,ly but the whole nation.
Affects the nation.
Why? Like, again, there seems to be like a duality of, over here in the New Testament, it's not like this man never would have been punished for the sins of his parents. Like, that's not why he was born blind. And then we go back to the Old Testament, and we're gonna have some pretty harsh punishment for his family, and then we're gonna punish the whole nation until that's resolved.
If I'm really, really honest,
I don't like this story.
Yeah,
that's one of my least favorite ones.
Yeah, if I'm really, really honest, there's part of this that really bothers me.
Yeah,
and I know, and I'll walk us through why. And the Bible, I think, makes it clear. But I'll be honest, it doesn't satisfy me.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay for us to have that sometimes with Scripture and just go, I'm still trying to figure this out. I think couple of differences between those stories. One, the nation of Israel was given a national command of purity, and so. And we're told, this is to protect all of you. These things belong to God. So one person's sin was a sin of the community. When we get to the New Testament, what they were talking about is, my personal sin, my personal decision, other people aren't held. And the question is, who's responsible for it? So here's the second thing. There's a difference between who's responsible for the sin and who suffers the consequences of it.
Yeah.
Because as a parent, certainly my children will sometimes suffer the consequences of my sin, whatever that looks like. And I think that comes into play with this. The third thing with this is, and this is a great teaching for us, it's a reminder, and we keep coming back to this thread. Sin is not a solo sport. That's maybe a bad way of saying it,
I
but
think that works.
Adam and Eve, whatever, the biggest lie ever told was, this will only affect me. And Adam and Eve, let's chase this thread all the way back.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve proved that. One sin, one fruit, And it affected all of us, and we're all still pretty ticked off at them. Achan, he thought this would just affect me, but it didn't just affect him.
Yeah.
It ultimately affected the family. And the last thing just goes back to, we need to understand different time. Tribalism, and other parts of the world would get this more than we would in the United States.
Yeah.
Other parts of the world would understand. I make a decision, it affects my village.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's part of that tribal identity. And so there was part of that came into it. Again, none of that fully satisfies it, but when I put it all together, I'm going, okay, I'm beginning to get some clarity. It's kind of like, where you see a picture out of focus and it begins to slowly come into focus. You begin to see what it is. You ever seen some of those where it's like, guess, to me, it's a little bit like that. And those things help me bring that into focus a little bit.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It brings it into focus a little bit. I'm not sure it would help me if I'm like Achan's kid standing there and I'm like, yeah, that's a great explanation you had there.
Except
I'm
here's
still
the deal.
Not thrilled.
They would have known.
Yeah, sure.
They would have known.
Let's wrap up with one thing, Pastor Mike. You talked about different strategies and things. Talked about keeping God at the center.
Yeah.
And then entering into every battle with God. Which both sound great.
Yeah.
They sound like sermon titles.
Sounds so good.
Or book titles.
Yeah.
Enter into every battle with God by Pastor Mike Score. Pick it up at your local bookstore. But can we have like some practicality to it? What does that look like in maybe all of our lives, those of us listening?
First, I'm going to give a couple of recommendations because we're going to kind of speed through this. If you want to go in it further, a couple books. One I talked about with Hattie a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Moses. And I think you're reading this book along with me right now. John Mark Comer, most people call him JMC.
The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry?
Ruthless Elimination of Hurry.
I'm not rushing through it, though.
Yeah.
I think I made that joke already on the podcast.
Did you? Would be a great book to pick up. I actually listened to it, and I got more out of it for me right now just because I listened to it. And then there's another book by one of my favorite authors on this, John Ortberg, called The Life You've Always Wanted. And either one of those books, I think they're very readable, very understandable, but they're very challenging because, like you said, to say put God at the center of your life and make worship the practice of your life, like we talked about in the weekend's teaching, sounds like, okay, yeah, it is absolutely revolutionarily, is that a word? Revolutionarily counterculture.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I talked about on the weekend is I've said this, I've known this intellectually, and again, you'd think, I'm in my 50s, you'd think I'd go, oh yeah, I've been practicing this for years. I'm just now wrestling at a much deeper level than with things like, and I talked about on the weekend, days when I'm so busy, like writing messages or writing sermon. It's like, I've got a deadline. We've got to record, we've got to do whatever. Okay, I'm going to get to the office early. I'm going to get going. God's saying, no, let's wait. Let's slow down. The more you have to do, and I think the more you are pouring into whatever in your world, I think the more you have to spend in silence and quiet and worship. One of the practices from another one of my favorite authors and thinkers on this, John Eldredge, that I've heard about for years, and I've always gone, yeah, but I haven't actually practiced it, if I'm really honest. And forgive me, Lord, but like even laying in bed this morning, I have a very full schedule today. It's just back to back, and for the next few weeks. And I just started praying through the schedule. And here's the prayer. It's, God, okay, my 8:30 this morning. What do you want to say about that? And here's the other thing. I didn't ask you whether I should do that or not. And then my 10 o'clock. Should I do that? Should I not do that? And there were actually a couple things I kind of removed from my schedule. And then a couple things I added into my schedule. And then even praying ahead to Thanksgiving. Okay, Lord, here's what we're planning for Thanksgiving with the boys. What would you like to do? Because he knows. And he knows what's best. He knows what my soul needs. Another one of the books I'm reading right now is Resiliency by John Eldredge, and he just talks about that. Are you listening and asking God instead of saying, God, here's what I'm going to do. Would you bless it? And that's taking God for granted instead of stopping and inviting him into this. And I think, so part of this for me, we say spending more time with God is even walking through the day with him. First thought before you roll out of bed. Good morning, Lord. Let's just spend a few minutes. Is there anything you want to say to me about today? And thank you, Lord. While I'm in the shower or shaving, just spending some time, again, listening. What's heavy on my heart? While I'm driving. So I just look for these key moments throughout the day. And in between some of the things I rush is to even take what I call the 10-second pause. Apple, I know you aren't a big Apple Watch person, but Apple, it's interesting how it creeps into the rest of the world. They've created some of this so they're aware of this, created some of this where the watch will even pop up every once in a while and say, just take a moment of mindfulness. Ooh. And it's like, and it sounds very New Age, it sounds very Eastern, it's also very biblical. To just stop and give God margin to speak, because we tend to fill things up. Just take some of those extended times. So it doesn't even have to be. Sometimes I think we need to spend an hour and a half.
Sure.
Sometimes it's just practicing mindfulness, keeping him at the center instead of inviting him into what we're already doing.
Yeah, that is a big difference. Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. Thank you for I assume that was our next step for the week.
Yep.
That's kind of where that question ended up. So I normally ask you for the next step, but I was like, I think we just got it. And we say every week on the Grow podcast that growth always starts with the next step. So that's why we always have a next step at the end, not just because Pastor Mike didn't have anything better to do at the end of the podcast. So let's make sure that we're intentional about that. And keeping God at the center of what we're doing. I think that's that picture of keeping God at the center as opposed to just like, I'm already doing this. Like, God, why don't you come along with me? Like hop in the passenger seat while I'm headed to work today or whatever. But
instead of God, go with me as I do, it's God, what would you like me to do as you're going?
But as you said, that's about as countercultural and even just counter our normal mindset as it gets. So that's something I'll have to try to be intentional about this week and going forward. But thank you, as always, Pastor Mike. It was so great talking with you today. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We always love hearing from you, so definitely let us know if you have any questions or thoughts or anything like that. Check the podcast notes for the that Tim Keller podcast link, and then those books that Pastor Mike talked about as well. Join us on the weekend. Promised Land will continue on Sunday online and at all of our campuses, and then we will see you next week on the Grow Podcast.